there's an exchange between the seventh ancestor named Shítóu, who wrote the Sandōkai, which is the poem we're going to read today. And he was a direct heir and student of Huineng, the sixth patriarch. So this is in the beginning of the 8th century in China. And Huineng, who wrote the Platform Sutra, is something I think we'll talk about next week. So we'll go back in time. And Huineng had a lot of followers because he was quite a renowned teacher. But interestingly, among all his hundreds of followers, Shíkítou's poem, The Identity of the Relative and the Absolute, that's the translation of the Sandōkai, is the only writing of his followers that became sort of embraced in the Zen world as, as chant, as canon in Zen chants. So that kind of 2-page poem is until today in the Soto Zen world chanted daily, and as much as the Heart Sutra is chanted. And it's something that we kind of haven't, we put it in this book. Where is it? The table of contents, the Sandōkai is page 12. We put it in here, and we kind of ignore it. It's like kind of interesting. We don't even know it's there. And then I just sort of, one day I'm flipping through here. What's in this little booklet? Oh yeah, the Sandōkai. And if you go on a Zen retreat anywhere in the world, you're going to be chanting it every day. But we tend to miss it. So I wanted to give it some due credit. And before we read it and look at it, back in the early 1970s, I've often referred to Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and that seminal book that most Zen students read and reread. But he actually ran a retreat where the whole retreat every day was a talk on the Sandōkai, on this poem, and it's called Branching Streams Flow in the Darkness, which is one of the verses. And I was reading through it today. It's really quite wonderful. It's like being on retreat with Suzuki Roshi, and every night there's a different talk on like 4 lines of the Sandōkai. So if you find this poem quite compelling, then you should consider looking at this book. If you can find it, it's worthwhile. So I was perusing through that. But more to the point was when I was thinking about how this relates to our meditation, because the poem itself sometimes seems a little abstract. You wonder, you feel like you need a talk in order to relate to it. And during Suzuki Roshi's talks, there was always a question period at the end. And several times, the question at the end of the talk was, well, how do I relate to this? Like, how do I relate to this? I mean, this seems like, a retreat talk, but how do I relate to it in my life? And the question is on the spot. It's really important. And it's a question you should be asking when you recite the Heart Sutra or when you sit zazen, you sit in meditation. How does this relate to my life? Because if it doesn't, or better yet, if it's not a question, your practice is missing something essential. You should not have this sort of separation that I can be calm here and crazy there. It'll happen anyway, right? But that shouldn't be, a given. it should be a question. How do I create a sense of togetherness and unity among these differences in my own life? And the identity of the relative and absolute, which is the Sandōkai, is precisely addressing that paradox we live in our practice. That, I have this peace and love, and I have a lot of anger and anxiety, and how do I see them fitting together without denying one or the other? How can I somehow practice with it all and not just say, this is the real me? The real me? What do you mean? So there's an exchange that was a few exchanges of when Shítóu Xīqiān, that's his name of the writer, the seventh patriarch ancestor. And as a teacher, he came up to a student, and a student was sitting in zazen, and he asked him, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" Odd question, which would probably make you wonder if you're sitting on a retreat and the teacher comes and says, "What do you think you're doing? What are you doing?" I mean, obviously the answer would be, well, he said, "I'm not doing anything at all," right? Which is kind of a smart answer, which is something you don't want to do, is try to be smart with the teacher. Be smart with everyone else, but not your Zen teacher. And and Shítóu said, "Well, in that case, you're wasting your time. You're doing nothing at all." Which is true. Because if we're doing zazen and we want it to be nothing at all, then it's not going to relate to the rest of our lives. We're not cultivating any of that kind of clarity that we want to cultivate. So if it really is doing nothing at all, then how are you going to extend it beyond just your sitting? So he's pointing out that, that attitude is problematic. To think that your sitting is, it just is. Which is a common approach in meditation circles, we could say, is just be. Oh, you want to be good. I mean, just being is not enough, right? It's enough for a frog, but not for a human. Right? Just be on the rock there in the swamp. That's fine. Okay? But as a human being, we need to cultivate some compassion and kindness and clarity in the midst of confusion and anger and, and hate. Like, we need to cultivate these things and reduce the negatives. So your meditation should be doing something. But while we're sitting, should we be working on that? So here's the paradox. You need to be present, but you also need to be cultivating the great mind. You need to be awakening, right? So Shítóu points out that sort of problematic attitude that is very common in meditation. I can just, everything's okay as it is. Yes and no, right? And no, because there's a lot of suffering going on. So we need somehow to bridge that gap. So then he continues. So the student then says, if I were working on something, like working on myself, then I'd be doing something. Shítóu answers, you say you're not doing anything. Tell me, what is this not doing? Like, what is it? What is that not doing? And the student replies, not even the 10,000 sages know. Which is the appropriate response, but it's a response that he probably learned somewhere. He probably learned that response somewhere. Not even the 10,000 sages know what this not doing is. Yeah, that's true, but you didn't say it. So the question is that not knowing, and there's a real important verse in the Sandōkai where he says, not knowing is most intimate. right? The not knowing, not conceptualizing, not immediately putting a label on your experience means you maintain that innocence, that freshness, that immediacy. And then when you need to work with it, you put labels on. It's not saying the labels are bad, right? They're useful, okay? But they're not absolute, they're relative. The absolute is the wordless there. So that wordless needs to be spontaneous and sincere. It can't be learned. Because as soon as you learn the right response, then what are you doing? You're imitating a Buddha. And you might fool everyone except yourself. So, Shítóu Xīqiān, when he first started studying with Huineng, he went and his Chinese name is actually called Stonehead because he sat on a stone ledge for 10 years. And that was his main practice of sitting on a stone ledge. Later on, as he started to gain followers and teachings, he did write. And his poem, The Identity of the... other than his time on the ledge and later on having a monastery with a lot of followers, very little is known about him. And I think it's intentional on his part because he really avoided crowds. There's another... one other piece of writing called The Song of the Grass Hut, which is a very beautiful poem. Did we read it a few weeks ago? We did read it, or we got to? Okay. So we read it, and he was also the writer of that. Now that didn't become part of the chanting verses, which probably is a good idea, but you should check out that one. So I want to read this a bit with you. Okay, the Sandōkai. And look at it. Everyone can see now? Okay, identity of the relative and absolute. By the way, san in Chinese and Japanese is 3, the number 3, ichi-ni-san. And do is from the Tao, the word the way, right? And kai is like a greeting. It's sort of a meeting. So the meeting of these 3 as the way. Now, that doesn't really sound good, does it? So identity of the relative and the absolute, a little better, but not much. Okay? The mind of the great sage of India was intimately conveyed from west to east. The other thing that's interesting in what we have here, I want to say is, for some reason, the format is like one long paragraph, which it usually isn't in most translations. I don't know how we formatted it here, but it seems like we just put it all down like one continuous thing, which is interesting. But it's interesting. Where do you stop and where do you start? I guess the periods are there for us to help us. The mind of the great sage of India, meaning the Buddha, was intimately conveyed from west to east. Okay, west to east was interesting because we usually think of the Dharma coming from the east, and now we're in the west. But originally, we're talking about the Buddha who was in northern India and Nepal, and then it was conveyed, and these people are in China, so obviously it went, Bodhidharma brought it over to China, and then to Korea and Japan. So that's why it went, here we're talking about from west to east. And the other thing you should notice here, that already should make you feel kind of like this is a bit different. It doesn't say the teachings of the great sage, okay? It doesn't say the way of the great sage. the mind. Okay, the mind of the Buddha was intimately conveyed. Intimately, like no gap. Okay, seamlessly. Like there's an identity there, meaning continuation. There's a transmission, which is expressing a really cardinal and central idea in Zen, that it's not through the teachings. It's a direct transmission of that big mind, that goes from person to person, right? From sentient being to sentient being, from generation to generation, from then until now. And this is what we're talking about here, is we're not saying we want to understand the teachings of the Buddha. We want to realize Buddha mind. This is the goal of our practice, is to awaken in our consciousness to the same mind that an awakened being has. To realize that mind intimately in the same way as the Buddha realized it. So that's the transmission here. It's direct and it's intimate, meaning it's you. So this is the mind of the great sage of India, was intimately conveyed from west to east. Among human beings are wise ones and fools, but in the way there's no northern or southern patriarch. Okay, so in a Buddhist point of view, the differences that we see in the world among people are the basis of our equality. Whereas outside of Buddhism, a normal point of view is that the differences are a reason for not being equal. Well, it's here, there are wise ones and fools, and they're all equal in the Buddha Dharma. So there's a great sort of equality here in the differences. It's not saying that we're all the same. That's the point of this verse here. It's not creating a sameness here. When we think of unity, it's not oneness, okay? It's the equality of all the differences. And that's an important thing, so that every human being has Buddha nature. Whether you're like a leper beggar on the streets of Calcutta, or you're a Wall Street banker, you have the same Buddha nature. Whether you are a professor or, someone just newborn without language, Buddha nature. Okay, so this is, he expressed it as the northern and southern school. Now that's a historical reference to the fact that in China, around this time, there was a big division between what was called the northern and southern school. And the northern school was the one what was considered the, Soto Zen, which was gradual enlightenment through long sitting and lifetimes of sitting. And the southern school was a more kind of rebellious, revolutionary one, which went for immediate awakening through koan practice, which was, struggling with these classic kind of questions between student and teacher that were meant to bypass intellectual discrimination and immediately realize your true nature through facing that and struggling with that question. It's kind of to short circuit your brain by giving it a little too much activity. That's the purpose of a koan. And in that short circuiting, when you see I can't do anything with this, hopefully that will trigger some opening. Okay, it'll make a crack in your defenses so that maybe you'll see some light. That's the purpose of the Southern School and the Koan School. And of course, they, disagreed with each other because you had big bureaucracies and big monasteries and big finances and territory. So they were at odds. And that's what this is referring to, is that in the Northern and Southern School, there's no Northern or Southern patriarch. In the great way, this way or that way. Choose your way. Okay. Indian, Western, Chinese, Israeli, choose your way. The subtle source is clear and bright. The tributary streams flow through the darkness. This is the title of this book, The Branching Streams Flow in the Darkness. Here we're talking about when we see the subtle source is clear and bright. Now that's a bit counterintuitive to what most of us experience. The main difference here, this kind of the duality we're working with, that Shítóu Xīqiān is working with, is that sense of what we read in the Heart Sutra, that there's a form and emptiness, and that form is, what he said, the tributary, the branching streams here. The branching streams, there's all the forms and they go many different ways all throughout the world. There are many ways form is expressed. And those are the branching streams. I didn't say branching streams here, what I said, tributary streams, whatever, same thing. But then we have the darkness. And that darkness is that emptiness. And it's not the darkness of, a lack. It's the darkness of something so full that no words will describe it. So what is the nature of your consciousness? What is the nature of your awareness? What is the nature of life and of the world? Who are you really? As soon as you answer that question, you have a tributary stream. You have a stream flowing, you have a certain form that you can identify. What's before all forms? Before all words? Before all ideas? What is that? What is the state of your mind before a thought arises to give you a sense of self? What is that state of mind? It's not pre-conscious. It's totally open and aware. It's actually knowing. So what is that? And this is sort of the journey of this poem, right? Is to say that no matter what, you're going to be going back and forth between these two seemingly, polar opposites, that we have form and emptiness, that we have these streams flowing through the darkness. But are they really separate? Are they separate? No? Is your sense of self and your open, aware Buddha nature, are they really two different things? This is a question that you should knock your head against. You should hit the wall against that question. Okay, if all sentient beings have Buddha nature, including myself, because I'm a sentient being, and yet my day-to-day sense of self is such that I feel pretty limited and frustrated, and happy sometimes, and generous sometimes, but pretty much another day. Like, where's the Buddha? And yet they're one. Yet it's one being. How can I somehow embrace that? Okay, how can I embrace that unity? How can I even acknowledge that unity? Can I? Can I acknowledge that unity? Or am I just playing with words? Like that student of Shítóu's who said, even the 10,000 sages don't know. But if I say, I am manifesting form and emptiness and Buddha nature and selfhood all at one, I'm like, that's a good answer, and it's wrong. So how can I really realize this unity in my life now? So that when I feel it's only the branching streams, I'm like, where do I go? How do I flow through this? How do I get through this day? How can I take some greater refuge in that darkness? That darkness that doesn't pretend to know. Because pretending to know is really limiting. It's really limiting. I want to read one passage from this book that Suzuki Hiroshi wrote in his commentary. He said, our effort in Zen, and this is on these verses right now. Our effort in Zen is to observe everything as it is. Yet even though we say so, we are not necessarily observing everything as it is. We say, here's my friend, over there is a mountain, and way up there is the moon. But your friend is not only your friend. The mountain is not only the mountain, and the moon is not only the moon. If we think I am here and the mountain is over there, that is a dualistic way of observing things, to cross over the Tassajara Mountains. That is our usual understanding. That is not the Buddhist way of observing things. We find the mountain, or the moon, or our friend, or San Francisco within ourselves, right here. That big mind within which everything exists. Now that is, his unique way of expressing it, which pretty much identifies the real truth of the matter. The mountain exists. Your friend exists. San Francisco exists. And they are all within you, within your mind. That doesn't mean they don't exist. But it means that your true mind contains all of it. That true awareness. And don't confuse mind with self. That's where we get problems, is that we start to think mind and self are identical. Self is shifting. Self is a branching stream in the darkness. Sometimes flows this way, sometimes flows that way. Meets some resistance, moves away. Meets something, interesting, goes towards it, right? Self is fickle. Self is unstable. Mind is stable. The awareness that you can return to again and again, that which knows everything, that's your true mind. That's your true mind. And if you have to say that's your true self, say it. Okay? But I think self is, we get problems when we talk about self. But just consider it your true mind. It's bigger than yourself. I'll continue a bit more, if we could. To be attached to things is illusion. To encounter the Absolute is not yet enlightenment. Okay, that's helpful. Because we tend to think if I'm unattached, then I'm close to enlightenment. Each and all, the subjective and the objective spheres are related, and at the same time, independent. Related, and yet working differently, though each keeps its own place. Form makes the character and appearance different. Sounds distinguish comfort and discomfort. The dark makes all words one. The brightness distinguishes good and bad phrases. I want to pause here for a second. We see the theme is repeated here in different ways. And it's really emerging from the Heart Sutra. When you reread the Heart Sutra after reading this, you'll find, it tends to flow one to the other and back again. Objective and subjective. Exactly what Suzuki Roshi was just saying. That they're related and independent. We can't understand them without each other. Just like we can't understand most definitions. They come from mind. And we tend to think that things are real out there, right? Like these differences we all acknowledge and agree upon. Like there's me and you. There's a man and there's a woman. There are glasses, there are eyes, there are shoes, there's a bell. Right? All of these definitions and differences. And some we like and some we dislike. First we agree that these things exist. And then we have these individual differences, like my opinion is about the bell is I like it, Oh, you don't like it? Well, that's your opinion. But we both agree there's a bell here, right? So they work together, but there's a certain point where we say, this is objective, and then it goes so far, and then it's subjective. Okay, so the objective is we agree upon the bell. And the subjective is how much you like it versus how much I like it, right? Or how new you think it is, or how new I think it is, or whatever, all these opinions about the bell. But we all agree that the bell is objective. what's being suggested here is that objective and subjective are not as separate as we think, that there's a lot more gradation and degree than what we tend to conventionally agree upon. And the subjective is much more functioning. It's much more functioning in the way we see the world. And that's why he's saying again, what Roshi said here, that the mountain, San Francisco, your friend, you're in your mind. You're in your mind. Yeah, you can touch your friend and say you're outside of your mind. But everything you think about your friend is in your mind. And you live according to your thoughts. And when you start to see that you're behaving towards the world, not because of the way the world is outside of you, but because of how you think about the world, that makes a huge difference in the way you can act. Because you're not acting in relation to an objective world. You're acting in relation to a subjective relationship, to how you view it. And that gives you a lot of power. Because the world's not given anymore. It's not just a fact. Deal with it or don't. It's something you're always making. You're making your relationship to the world at every moment. That's the subjective and objective working all the time together. There's no world given. You're creating it as you view it. Now, you depend on a lot of, habits and conditioning in the mind. But still, all that's doing is defining your subjective, approach. It takes a certain amount of work that is sometimes uncomfortable to notice how you are projecting so much of reality onto what we think is objective. It's, as Suzuki Roshi says in another section, it may be, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily so. The way you see the world, that could be. There could be a table here. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's a table here. But everything I think about that table, not necessarily so. Not necessarily so. Now, for a table, it's not really terribly moral. But for a person, it is. When we start to take this into the relationship field, then it's huge. Because when you can say, everything I think about this person and about myself and about that nation and about this reality of people, not necessarily so. It seems to be a lot coming from my mind. And that doesn't make it wrong. It just doesn't make it absolutely true. It makes it relative. Relative to what? To you and your experience. When we talk about the relative world, what do we mean? It's relative to you, right? To the viewer, to the thinker. So the relative world is coming from you. And when you start to observe that more in your mind and how you react, it actually gives you a lot of flexibility in what you can do with those thoughts. Because you're not just dealing with facts all the time. You're dealing with a real subjective reality that is based on your point of view. And it's not necessarily so. Right? It's humbling and empowering at the same time. You see that? So, let's continue a bit, since we only have a bit left of time, that is. Sounds distinguish comfort and discomfort. The dark makes all words one. The brightness distinguishes good and bad phrases. The four elements return to their nature as a child to its mother. Fire is hot, wind moves, water is wet, earth hard. Eyes see, ears hear, nose smells, tongue tastes the salt and the sour. Each is independent of the other. Cause and effect must return to the great reality. Suzuki Roshi created a term called independency. that these, the form, the color, the taste, the senses, they're existing independent of each other. But there's a kind of independency, So like I hear the kettle, right? And later maybe I'll taste the tea. Seems my hearing the kettle and tasting the tea are different things. They exist independently. He said, no, it's actually a independency. Independency. It's simultaneously independent and dependent, right? That there's form and emptiness. There's this difference and the unity simultaneously, seamlessly, intimately, at the same time. So our real challenge in this practice, when you walk out the door, is to see the equality of differences. Right? To see all these differences that you experience, and some you like and some you dislike. But that's your subjective view, which may serve you and may be appropriate. It may be appropriate to dislike things, and it may be appropriate to like things, but it's relative to you. You're not describing an absolute reality. The absolute reality that you're living in, simultaneously to the relative one, is dark and unknown. That doesn't mean you're not living it. It's just not something you can think about. Because as soon as you do think about it, you're creating relative views relative to you. But you need to relax and know that those views can exist because there's something vaster, deeper, and darker, unknown to your thinking mind, but lived by your life, by your mere being here, alive and awake. That is the trust that you need to cultivate by living day by day. That your mind is Buddha mind directly transmitted. And you don't necessarily have to know it. What you know is relative truth. Let it serve you and others well. But you won't get hung up on it because you'll be able to trust in something deeper and darker. Dark just means unknown to your thinking mind. So let us finish here and then we'll call it a night. Within light there is darkness. We're on the fourth line from the bottom. But do not try to understand that darkness. This is kind of what I was just saying. Within darkness there is light. But do not look for that light. Light and darkness are a pair, like the foot before and the foot behind in walking. Each thing has its own intrinsic value and is related to everything else in function and position. Ordinary life fits the absolute as a box in its lid. The absolute works together with the relative like two arrows meeting in midair. Reading words, you should grasp the great reality. Do not judge by any standards. If you do not see the way, you do not see it, even as you walk on it. When you walk the way, it is not near, it is not far. If you are deluded, you are mountains and rivers away from it. I respectfully say to those who wish to be enlightened, do not waste your time by night or day. That famous ending has inspired dozens of generations of Zen students. And it should startle you a little bit. It should give you a little push. But that push is coming after the sense of being reassured that ordinary life and your enlightened, awakened state fit each other seamlessly, like a box in its lid. Or another great image, famous one, two arrows meeting in midair. Seems impossible. It seems absolutely impossible to have two arrows shoot and meet in midair. What are the chances? Well, the same chances as your relative life and your absolute Buddha mind being one life. That's how rare and amazing it is. And it's pretty much almost as rare as being born a human, as having all the privileges and the mind that a human being has. So the fact that shows that you beat those odds, and you are a manifestation of that box and lid right now. So with that encouragement, we should take his final words seriously. This is a rare opportunity. It's extremely rare, like two arrows meeting in midair. You have a mind, and you are alive. And you have a self, and you can use it well, and not be fooled by it. You should not abandon yourself. You should just not be fooled by it. And with that, we will, as he said, we won't waste our time by day or night.